Welcome to MacroHive Conversations with Bilal Hafiz. MacroHive helps educate investors and provide investment insights for all markets from crypto to equities to bonds. For our latest views, visit macrohive.com. Now, on to this episode's guest, Dr. Kyle Keane. Kyle is a senior lecturer in Assistive Technologies at the University of Bristol, where he leads research at the intersection of AI, human cognition, and assistive technology design. He has a background in quantum computing and computational physics, where he applies the scientific rigor of a physicist to studying human perception and the engineer's precision to designing tech that translate complex information into interpretable, multi-sensory experiences. Previously, Kyle was a lecturer and research scientist at MIT, and he has also worked for Wolfram Alpha. Now, on to our conversation. So greetings and welcome, Kyle. It's fantastic to have you on the podcast show.
Thank you so much, Bilal. I'm very excited to be here and share some information.
Great. That's excellent. Now, before we go into the meat of our conversation, I do like to ask my guests something about their origin story. So it'd be great to hear in your own words, what did you study at college? Was it inevitable you'd end up in science and research and in all the different endeavors you've done since then? So we could kind of hear in your own words your story.
I'll try to keep it short because I do get very verbose and excited about my story sometimes. So I'll give the short version and then you can dig in for more details if you want. The highlights that I like to put out there, I think one thing that made something inevitable here is that at age 2, I was diagnosed with retinitis pigmentosa, which is a degenerative eye condition that causes gradual blindness. And I was told at some point in the future, whether it's in 3 years or 80 years, nobody knows, you will go blind. And between now and then, your vision's going to be changing constantly and unpredictably. So I think one fundamental seed that was laid was this concept of probability, not knowing how long a thing is going to last and not knowing what it's going to be like along the way. And so at age 2, I was already contemplating the loss and the reliance on things like eyesight. And that carried me forward with a lot of curiosity. I got to spend a lot of time with very high-end doctors talking about the retina and vision and eyesight and how these things all relate to each other. And then in college, I started studying physics. I think I had this fundamental interest in not only how we perceive the world, but how do we make sense of the world? And how do we
and just to be clear, Carl, when you were at college, at that point, what was your sight like at that point?
Fair. Right. I know I do sometimes skip over the important multi-threaded narrative. So by the time I got to college, I luckily still had some vision. I was using some adaptations, but not too many at the beginning. But by the end, I was already having some complications. So okay. I was still fairly functional. I carried a white cane already because at night, my vision got really bad and I needed it sometimes in unfamiliar environments. But during the day, I was fairly typically functional. I didn't drive a car anymore, so that was one of the big losses. But as far as plugging wires into small holes in order to build electronics projects and running large machines to cut steel into parts that would go into vacuum chambers so that we could study electron scattering, probabilistic scattering of electrons through gases of different types. I was sort of typically sighted and capable of doing all the scientific stuff, but I couldn't drive a car. So I was already starting to learn about this differential capability.
Okay, yeah. So sorry, I interrupted you. You said you had this curiosity about physics.
Oh, yeah, right. So, and it is sort of this. I was already starting to see some of these capabilities were different, but I got really into the fact that even in the midst of all these different ways of being in the world and communicating and experiencing the world, there was this fundamental curiosity about how do people make agreements about what reality is and how do they share humbly information about what their current hypothesis and working model of the world is. And I really enjoyed the way that physicists had developed over centuries the ability to talk about my current hypothesis about the system is this. We believe these things to be true. They're evidenced by this. But as soon as somebody comes and, says that evidence is no longer valid because we've actually shown this other thing, they have this adaptability, this ability to say, okay, cool, my working model of the world is now going to incorporate this new information, and it's not going to take it as an absolute belief. It's going to take it as the best information I have now. And from the best information, I'm going to make a guess about what the future holds and how best to talk about the present moment. So I love this probabilistic sense of agreeing upon our best understanding of the moment and making hypotheses to move things forward. And the sort of, what we see is what we believe is often what we're told.
Yep.
And in fact, what we see is so little of what we end up as scientists discovering. We made telescopes and we made microscopes in order to, peer at things that our unaided, unassisted eyes aren't able to allow us to see as scientists.
And so, after college, then you continued in research, didn't you? Is that correct?
I did, yeah. So,
and I mean, what motivated you to kind of pursue the academic path?
It was, it's a life decision point. There was, at the time, as economies do, things fluctuate. And as an individual in a larger economy, I only have access to the parts of that economy that I happen to know about or have methods of getting access to. And looking at my options, it was, fairly clear. I applied to graduate programs, I applied to PhD programs, and I threw some job applications out there. I had more excitement about grad school when the offer came back than any of the jobs. And so I chose the path of most excitement under the, the privilege of being able to do so. It came with the scholarship, so I didn't have to worry about the financial considerations of that decision. I mean, it was one of those complicated partial information decisions. You have to take a risky move and hope that in the long run it pays off, even if the short term maybe doesn't quite hit in the way that you can immediately forecast benefit from. And I'm glad I did. That to me was one of those pivotal moments where I took a decision and followed an intuition and an instinct, and things have evolved from there in absolutely incredible ways that I'm really, grateful to be a part of.
And you were at MIT for a long time. I mean, what were your main areas of focus there?
Yeah, so the last 10 years or so, I was over at MIT in Massachusetts, and the main focus, so the thread that carried through was assistive technology. Yeah. I had a class where we would take the final year engineering students, and we had it approved to be in mechanical engineering, electrical engineering, computer science, and then we also had quite a few other programs that would send their students to us. These students would form a small team, and we would curate local people who had disabilities, who had a particular life activity that they wanted to accomplish. And the local community member with the disability would drive an innovative project forward, and the engineering students would have to go through an iterative design process, test prototypes, and build out a functional version of a thing that would empower that person to actively engage in the thing that they want it to do. So it was to solve a particular life activity with a technological intervention, which I always like to say is not the only solution to things, sometimes social and sometimes cultural and sometimes individual. There's lots of different ways to address problems. I happen to be really gifted in the technological one and well positioned to do that. And so I did what I could with what I had.
I mean, what one of the things I've noticed about your career and your work is that it's very multidisciplinary. You seem to stand between so many different disciplines. I think some of your original background or training was in quantum and computational physics, for example, with engineering as well thrown into the mix. So, I mean, how it's not so conventional, I would say. I know lots of academics, and people tend to be very siloed. They're like laser focused in one little area of the academic, world, in physics or engineering or economics or whatever, and they zoom in on that and become super experts. So can you talk a bit more about why, say why quantum and computational physics and engineering? Like why have that? What does that bring to the table?
Yeah. And so we'll fill in the other threads. So now we've painted the sort of, I'm now at University of Bristol focusing on assistive technology and driving innovations to help people do things. But between graduate school, I started to get into quantum computing. I was a computational physicist working on simulations that helped build, test, and verify the systems that ended up being acquired by Google for their quantum computing team. And I loved it. I was really, again, there's always sort of this multi-level interest that can keep me engaged. So my PhD dissertation was on partial quantum measurement. So extracting a little bit of information out of a system induces actual physics into the system. And that to me was just so philosophically rich, which was not just probability, but probability with a direct impact on reality. And getting to study that and understand this system where, you're doing what's called a Bayesian update, which forecasters may understand as a thing, right? So you're taking some information, your probabilities need to change given the fact that you have some new information. And the fact that that was a feedback loop into quantum reality was really thrilling and laid a foundation unexpected at the time, which was that I had to use stochastic differential equations and Bayes' theorem inside of complex matrices and tensors. Those two mathematical techniques end up being highly useful inside of forecasting complex modeling systems. So if you have a multi-timescale forecast and you want to be able to understand how it's going to evolve in time, the one very good method of doing that is a stochastic differential equation. And that is also the same thing you use, because in quantum physics, the way that you describe the system is with a probability distribution. And in fact, the evolution of a quantum system is literally just a statistical forecast in a actual real space rather than in a high dimensional financial space. But we're still doing probabilistic forecasting out into the future. So it ends up being kind of really fascinating philosophical thing, but also gave me some mathematical fundamentals that tie directly into forecasting, as well as neural nets and artificial intelligence, which are, large matrix operations. And we're trying to have these large networks evolve over time and trying to describe them. So, the thing that I kept bringing to the table was this ability to look at really high dimensional data and do statistical forecasting of some type using all sorts of funny scientific tips and tricks. And we'll now jump to MIT again, and the way that I entered that ecosystem was teaching computational material science. So we were looking at hugely complex systems. We have something on the order of tens of millions of atoms, and we're trying to simulate what happens at a certain temperature with this big collection of atoms that we call matter, right? We have a big block of metal, and if I raise the temperature, at some point that metal is going to start to soften, and then it's going to melt. And those are materials property changes, but that's just a really high level, high dimensional scientific simulation, which again ends up being something very similar to forecasting as well as artificial intelligence and things like that. How do you look at large aggregate statistics of a system rather than each individual atomistic piece of that system? So these kind of large abstract mathematical skills allowed me to enter into computational materials science. I also spent some time in physics and brain and cognitive science, because MRIs are also just high dimensional data analysis. The last few years I was in a lab called the Quest for Intelligence, which was studying the intersection between brain and cognitive science and artificial intelligence, which ended up being a really fascinating place to be. So we're moderating large grant proposals from groups of professors who were wanting to do some highly interdisciplinary collaborative project. I was fairly well situated because I had worked across all these domains to be able to help translate across the domains and distill down some of the essential mathematics and facilitate some of this collaboration.
Actually,
across...
on that, it would be good to get some advice on. I mean, how do you go about ensuring this kind of multidisciplinary approach works? Like if you're kind of coordinating all of these different disciplines, there's a risk that you end up not synthesizing things that well, or ends up just people crosstalk against each other? And I mean, what's the secret of your success in terms of being able to sort of draw them all together?
So I think it's genuinely the sort of busybody nature of my career. The class that I was talking about, the Assistive Technology Co-Design class, I was not only teaching that at MIT, I got quite a few grants to go set up international partnerships at universities. And so we were flying to, I'd take 10 MIT students over to India, and we would work with local university partners, local disability advocacy groups, and local people who have disabilities. And we would pull together these multi-stakeholder groups, and now dealing with across culture and across discipline and across language and across ability, and trying to pull people together toward a shared goal. And coordinating everyone was somehow this, emergent superpower that I developed over time just from running a lot of classrooms and running summer schools and managing teams. There is a bit to, I worked, had the great pleasure of working at Wolfram Research for a number of years and getting to manage software teams and be a part of professionally operational software development teams with project managers and things like that. I think I learned a lot about how to coordinate people, set goals, move them towards goals, and help them understand each other is often the biggest friction point.
Yeah, no, that's great. Now, earlier you talked about forecasting, and of course, much of our audience are finance people, and they love to find new things that can forecast markets better. So there has been a lot of work in terms of using artificial intelligence and things like that, or neural networks and decision tree models to try to forecast markets. So it'd be good to kind of get your thoughts on a system like financial markets, which at some level is a complex system. There's humans, interacting all of the time, absorbing information, updating prices, and so on. So, if you approach financial markets, how do you conceptualize that as a problem to solve?
It is. I have approached multiple times. I've written many different types of forecasting models, and it's the hardest part. So the framing of the thing for me, I'll just sort of talk about it in the way that I think about it. We have not only individual actors buying and selling things. That sort of used to be the thing that drove a lot of markets, and it still does in some ways, but it's now, as with everything, technologically mediated. So there's algorithms that are doing things like monitoring Twitter to understand the sentiment, how people feel about a particular company, or how many people have mentioned a particular company. So we have all these aggregate metrics, and all those aggregate metrics get gobbled up into an algorithm that makes a trade or no trade type of decision. And it's those algorithms that we're now competing with. So it was already a fairly complex system before. And now you have these algorithms that are all competing with each other on timescales that are quite difficult to conceptualize, because we don't know every algorithm that's monitoring data or trying to execute trades. And one complexity is finding the time scale on which other people aren't yet forecasting. So if you're thinking about, I'm looking at the daily trade, and I can then, with the daily trade, make a prediction about what's going to happen next on weekly basis, or I'm looking at hourly trades and I'm trying to make a prediction about what's going to happen on daily basis. I'm doing multi-time scale forecasting, and everyone is trying to dig in on different time scales to figure out where they can find an untapped statistical signal. And we don't know what everyone else is searching for. So we're playing this very, very fun kind of just try something, see if you can find a signal and tell nobody else about it.
Yeah.
And it's hard because that means you don't get to know what everyone else is doing. So we're searching inside of this big, wild west of a thing. And the problem is actors drive the market. So if I'm forecasting on one time scale and somebody else is doing it on another, and there's a bunch of people who have tapped a particular time scale, they're going to have upstream consequences. So it really does become this like stacked problem of multiple complex systems all interacting with each other in ways that become, really hard to mathematically model unless you start to trust. And this is the dangerous game, is neural nets and artificial intelligence can do some of these things in incredibly powerful ways, but not all AI is the same. And so I'll get a bit kind of advisey, if that's all right. Can I kind of share a moment?
Yeah.
So one of the things to be careful of is everyone says, AI can do a thing. And the truth is, yes, but partially because AI now means tons and tons of different things to tons of different people.
Yeah.
There are particular neural networks that can do multi-timescale optimization. And one of the hardest things is to make sure that somebody who's trying to tell you that they have a technology that does a thing is have them really explain it in sufficient detail to be able to verify that it's going to do the thing that they're saying it will do. And you need to have an expert in that very specific technology to be able to verify, or you're going to just have to trust them because they're not going to let you drill all the way down to the core of their technology because they put these kind of trade secret intellectual property barriers around their particular algorithm. So it becomes this really complex game of, if I'm going to trust your algorithm, I can either just look at your performance and hope it will continue to do the thing, or if you don't have any historical performance, which we all know is the adage is it does not indicate future performance, then I need to really understand at a deep technological level your algorithm and whether it can actually do the thing that you're saying it can do. We do know how to do statistical modeling on incredibly complex stacked, chaotic and complex systems. We can make levels of probabilistic forecast that are meaningful, but it requires really specific technology run by really good experts. And a lot of people, because they know that not everyone is deep inside of the weeds of these systems, will give false confidence about, oh yeah, AI can do it. I have an AI system. Okay, what is your AI system? What algorithm are you running? What hardware are you running it on? You need to get somebody in there to do due diligence on the level of technology before you engage with trusting anybody who says my AI can do the thing. Just because AI can do the thing does not mean that that person's AI can do the thing.
Understood. And kind of a related point is the whole black box nature of many of these types of approaches. Like, for example, neural nets. You aren't quite sure why it's come up with a signal in the end, because obviously it's got multiple different layers and it does its magic, and then output comes out. And then often I find when we build some AI model, especially it's like a neural network type model, then somebody will ask, okay, so why did it generate that signal? And then you say, the neural net did. I don't know why exactly. I mean, I don't know what was acting on what, and it gets too difficult. So, how do you approach that issue of explainability?
Yeah,
I mean, this is not just for finance. I mean, this is a generalized problem.
It's a general
for using,
issue. Yeah, it's absolutely a general AI issue, and there's not great solutions. So being able to understand the architecture and being able to specify the architecture and every single one of the what we call weights inside of the neural network, all of the statistical associations of its data processing nodes. Those are not the statistical associations of the higher level structures that it's finding in the data. We don't yet know how to build some of those higher level aggregate interpretable abstractions. And so it is a big issue in that I don't. I taught Introduction to Artificial Intelligence and Machine Learning at MIT for a number of years, and that this is one of the exciting moments in science is we have discovered a system that can do something amazing, and we haven't yet figured out how to get it to be interpretable. I think that's a wonderful moment in a classroom, but there's a real challenge in, if you're trying to use this technology for something and you want to understand how much you can depend and rely on it, and you want to be able to understand its justification for the actions it's taken and be able to predict whether that justification is something you want to trust in the future. Right now, there's not a great mechanism to do that. There's there's things that will make it look like it's doing that. You can ask a neural net, like a large language model, to explain its behavior, and it will generate words that will sound like an explanation. There's very little evidence that most of those things are actually tied in any way to a logical system that one could rely on, in the same way that you and I, if I ask you to explain why you did a thing, we've been socialized to have explanations based on our cultural norms and our emotional experience and our empathy and our understanding of our impact on other people. And we can say, I did that and I realized that hurt your feelings. I'm very sorry. I was, feeling a sense of urgency in my brain and anxiety about not having enough. And so I did something. That's an explanation that, as long as we, are being honest and having integrity in our explanations, you can trust. But even in a human, they can make a story and be performative. And even weirder when an AI system starts to generate language that seems to indicate that it's having some level of, oh, I did that because blank. You can't trust blank is actually connected to the action that it took. And that's really fundamentally kind of unsettling as a trader. That is very unsettling. As a scientist, that's fascinating because we want to understand the core of the decision. But as a trader, when you move out into an industry focused application, it's just kind of unsettling. Like I don't actually have a good answer for that one. I'm so sorry.
No, that's fine. I've been asking all my kind of AI expert friends the same question, and we all know the answer. That at the moment it's not clear. Now earlier you were talking about probabilities and Bayesian approach, and one of the things you liked about sort of physics and the quantum approach is this whole probabilistic perception of everything, of reality and so on. One issue with like probabilities I've always found is, from a mathematical statistical perspective, it obviously helps if you have some notion of the distribution, what probability distribution you're using. So you could say, okay, in this regime, I have this probability distribution, this regime, I have this different probability distribution. And the issue in finance often is that we don't know what distribution we're in. And often, sometimes it's a normal distribution, sometimes it's a power distribution, sometimes it's a distribution we've never seen before because it's just, just outliers, things like Nassim Taleb has talked about. How do you think about like, the challenge of understanding what distribution you're in at any point in time?
Right. And that's sort of traditional statistics requires you have a sense of a named distribution, right? Something that we have some comprehension of, that we've been able to, do some, what is the mean and the median and what's the standard deviation. We've been able to understand that distribution. So a lot of traditional modeling comes from, we have some data, let's fit it to a normal curve, a Gaussian, and let's assume it's that thing, and then we know all these great properties about a Gaussian distribution. So in the AI space, the concept of distribution is a bit broader, and it's just any collection of data gets fit to some wiggly line thing, some continuous approximation for some discrete data that it's seen. That it's absorbed and done some analysis on. That distribution is not a known thing, and it tries to do some level of forecasting given this abstraction of a distribution. But I think it's important there to have the discernment.
Okay, understood. Yeah.
Some are traditional statistical named distributions, and some are just a gathering of data with a continuous fit curve to it. And it is still a fundamental issue in AI because we're not doing the fitting to a statistical named distribution. It's really important to understand that it's doing what might be a horrible thing by saying, I have whatever data you've given me, I'm going to do a continuous curve fit to it. And I'm going to assume that is in fact a valid distribution on which I can do statistics. But sometimes it's absolutely not. And, you didn't give it enough data, but it doesn't know that you haven't given it enough data. And when you're doing forecasting, you are doing these kind of finite amounts of data used to grab a model that is, a distribution of what's about to happen. And if you're not giving enough data, it doesn't always know that it's not enough data because it doesn't
Yeah.
know anything about this abstraction of a distribution that it uses.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah. So it's the problem is we don't know what distribution we're in. One way to say that there's a solution is to say AI just figures it out.
Yeah.
But the truth is that it just figuring it out is not equivalent to our old school statistical method.
Okay. Yeah, understood. And in your work, I've noticed that you like to. There's different ways you describe your work. But one is the more general one is how humans interact with information, as kind of a sort of general sort of principle. So can you talk a bit more about that?
Yeah, I mean, I'll spin back into the, I myself am very severely visually impaired.
Yeah.
And I, for a really long time, have had this fascination back to the sort of days of my grad school. I was doing all of my scientific modeling and computing in a particular software, and my vision was getting bad enough that I needed to change the colors and the font size, which back then was not nearly as common as it is now. Now every app kind of people put things in dark mode and they can customize the font. Back then it was very uncommon, and especially in scientific software still is oftentimes. And so I was already starting to modify the interface through which I was engaging with the scientific code, as well as the result of that code, the data that I was getting out, the information that I was getting out. And it was, this highly dynamic process of, I once learned to read a bar chart, and a bar chart was, a rectangle that was blue next to another rectangle that was blue, and it had just a certain amount of space between it. It was this very specific visual thing. And, color, we can now start to say, okay, fine, color doesn't matter. Let's change the color and assume that color doesn't mean anything.
Yeah.
And if there's different colors, then maybe it means something else. When I started to do a lot of work on interface, like data visualization, data representation, I already started to see the abstraction of the way that we present information is different than the information itself. And then that became even more extreme as I started to try to sonify data, make sound out of data so that I could listen to things and interpret it. And that works very well for high level, high dimensional data in what, if you know the algorithm and you're using the same playback devices, and you're sampling at the same sample rate, there's a bunch of technical things that need to be in place. And you can actually, hear really high dimensional data structures. And that process of abstracting and then trying to help in the assistive technology domain, we're always trying to help people get access to information. And sometimes that is through computer interfaces that nobody else has yet played with, or used in that particular way. So making sound out of data, there's force feedback, robot arms that you can grab onto and interact with, and the amount of force that it's applying to your hand can be interpreted as data. You can, you can have vibration through, hands. You can have haptics things and like game controllers. If you're thinking about playing the Xbox and the thing rumbles a bit, that's information. It's just not the traditional way that we're thinking about, data visualization and trading. It's still, access to information and trying to interpret that in some fundamentally useful way. And you need to find a representation that's perceptually relevant, interpretable, and actionable.
Yeah. And why has it been so hard to convert like text to audio? Like over the years, we've had so many, attempts. Like you go to your Word document, you say, okay, read out an audio, and it sounds terrible, tinny, and it doesn't, punctuate at the right point. Or for example, when you try to transcribe someone's voice, it often does a bad job. Siri, over the years has not been great. I guess with LLMs now, that seems to be improving things. But what is the challenge here from a technical perspective? Why is it so hard?
It's a heck of a good question that I don't think I don't have a strong hypothesis. Let me be mildly humble. I know that the way that we used to synthesize speech was the concept of phonemes and trying to synthesize speech. Okay, there's at least one thing, which is we are analog devices. So you and I vibrate up through this ecosystem, and we produce these vibrations, and we can modulate them through really complex analog processes that are connected to cognition and emotion, and somehow our final analog signal transmits this huge amount of information, which is actually the thing that's helpful. Generating pure speech, one challenge is, for me as a blind user, I use a computer in a way that generates speech on the fly, and that means I need it to be able to be paused and redirected and interrupted at any given moment. And it can't have done a really high-level synthesis of the entire page, vocal synthesis, sound synthesis. So if I want to produce a particular waveform, so let's think about a nice sine curve. If I have a nice sine curve and I want to reproduce that sine curve with every level of fidelity, then I cannot sample it at 1/2 of the period. Otherwise, it's going to be a jagged zigzag curve.
Correct.
So I need to sample it fast enough. And if I'm doing something like Fourier synthesis in order to generate a sound, I need to have a sample rate that is 2 times the highest frequency that is present in the thing that I'm trying to synthesize. And every sample of the thing takes a bit of compute time. And so if I want a really, really, really high fidelity audio sample, I need to sample it a ton of times. So even if I have computed the perfect waveform, which represents exactly the speech I want to synthesize, if I don't sample it sufficiently, then it's not going to sound as good. And there's limits to my computational ability to sample it. That ends up making the sound file really, really, really big. So it makes it difficult to transmit it across inside of the device or across the internet. So you have to synthesize it, you have to transmit it, and then you have to play it back. And oftentimes the final playback mechanism of the technology has some limiting factor as to how much of a sample rate it's actually willing to handle. So there's all of these complexities about transmitting a really high quality audio thing that I at least on my side have had issues where when I've tried to synthesize a really short piece of text, but I want it to do really human-like modeling, it took forever. Like literally a word would take 3 hours in order to compute all of the waveforms and then sample it discreetly and then package it into a file. And that file was absolutely massive. So there are just sort of engineering limits.
Okay, no, that's a great point. Actually, I didn't think of it in that way. And I guess that's why often some of the simple text audio sound so tinny, because they're just trying to minimize just the compute power, just resources and such. No, it's a good point.
But same thing as high frequency trading, right? It's all about efficiency, making each operation just as good as it needs to be to get the job done. And the crazy part, like AI and neural nets are starting to do this, but that's because they do really high dimensional curve fitting, and so they're doing generation of human voice at a rate that is genuinely astonishing. So there is a fun technological play that I don't think people are fully wrapping their head around. The incredible innovation there is being able to generate a high dimensional thing like a human voice on the time scale that some of these systems are doing it is actually really fundamentally interesting technology that can be used to generate any other very high dimensional data that we want to be able to look at. If you want it to, for instance, do a statistical forecast of a stock, if you have enough training data, it could then do that without having to do sort of brute force, calculations every step along the way. But the problem is you need so much data, and we have copious amounts of humans talking data. So they've been able to use that to create these kind of phoneme transition things that will smooth between each of the different phonemes in a nice naturalistic way. But
and actually this kind of leads on to a broader question about AI, where there's a sort of debate in the AI field around, and what's in true intelligence, what's
Mhm.
consciousness, and is our current form of AI, especially LLMs, which seem very human-like, are they just stochastic parrots, just mimicking what it's like to be human? And a related point then is that one of the features of humans are that we're embodied. We're not just our brain. We have a body as well that's multisensory. And there's something about being embodied that generates intelligence or human-like intelligence. So what are your kind of thoughts on kind of this hard question?
Um, yeah, it's a great question. It's a big, 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 big question. So so to start with, the concept of intelligence is a tricky one to define in general.
Yeah.
And the best thing that we've ever been able to do is characterize a discrete set of capabilities that a system can do. And that is something. So you put a student in elementary school through an exam, and
Yeah.
they accomplish a set number of things, and then our hope is that whether they can do that set number of things will have some probability that in the future they'll be able to do some other things. So education and our ability to characterize intelligence, or this a very tricky word. Our attempts over the years to do this have been tied to people's ability to accomplish particular capabilities, and their performance on a set of tests, we hope has some statistical indication of what they're going to be able to do in the future
Yeah.
on things that they've never been tested on before. Um, and this is sort of a fraught and complex thing, who has had the power to test and who defines tests. And my very direct issue is, like, I often can't take the test because it's delivered in a technology that's incompatible with a blind person.
Yeah.
So not to say anything strong about this as the only way we should be doing it, but this is how we've thought about this word intelligence. Has emerged from this concept of testing a bunch of capabilities and then seeing how well that correlates to untested capabilities.
Yeah.
And certainly, given our current method of testing some things, which is like verbal puzzles, we are testing the system like a large language model and saying, wow, it must be intelligent because it's capable of doing this thing. And it's a bit of a mystery as to whether it having done that thing means that it is capable of doing the thing. So it's still not quite pointing at the fact that it is intelligent, but I don't know it's any less indicative than the fact that we can do it, and we just assume that it means that we have some intrinsic capability. So there's a danger in taking our human level examinations and applying it to AI and assuming just because it can do the same set of discrete capabilities that we can do, as measured through the same mechanisms that we measure ourselves, that it is in fact going to be able to do the same level of statistical correlation, things that it has never been tested on being able to do or taught how to do. So that transferability of skills is this fundamentally important thing that I think of when I think of intelligence. It's really about, a set of capabilities, respecting that you need to interface the person, and your tests need to, in fact, be informed by the things that they can do, and that there may be a whole separate test which would have a whole different result for that particular person. So a particular test is not an indication of a intrinsic characteristic of a human. It is just one particular indication of how they did on this particular test, which may have statistical performance.
I guess one challenge to assess the transferability right now is that many of these LLM models out there, whether it's OpenAI, Claude, Google, and so on, their training sets are private and secret. So we don't know what they're being trained on. So it's hard to know what is truly kind of out of sample. Like, was the tests that they're taking, was it within their training sets? In which case, obviously, they're doing quite well. but is outside their training set or not. So what really is an emergent or transferable property of these LLM models?
And we are likely to see. So I'm doing a bit of consulting with some people who have been asked by the FDA in the U.S., the Federal Food and Drug Administration, to understand data set reuse in medical diagnostics and things like this, which suffer from that same exact issue, which is we may start to feel like it's an emergent phenomenon that the system has just suddenly been able to do something.
Yeah.
But it may be just a natural consequence of the fact that, accidental federated learning is happening where, people are swapping data sets and slicing and dicing them and training models and then training models off of other models. They're generating data from this one and then training it off of the generated data. There's so much stuff happening again. Same as, a stock is this really hard thing to forecast because it's such a complex, stacked, chaotic system. Inside of these neural nets and them being trained by various data sets that are not transparent or controlled, and we don't know who trained from what, we're going to start seeing this emergent phenomenon and people being able to say, my system does this thing that it was never trained to do. But without that full stack trace of everything that came from their architecture and every piece of data, it's going to be really hard to know because there are these kind of trade secret boundaries again.
Yeah.
And, if you got full access to everything they did, you could reproduce it. And of course, no company that wants to protect its intellectual property is going to give away the full stack of everything it did to create a model. Unless they have a really clever commercial play for doing so, or they're already moving on to something interesting and they want to kind of signal the world, hey, we're better. We're so good that we're able to even give you this because our next thing is going to be so much better, which is amazing. Please keep doing that, corporate giants, because it does really help people like me and academics be able to build on top of infrastructure that we don't often have access to.
Yeah. And then the point on embodied intelligence, the fact that humans have bodies, we have a brain, it's not just a brain in a vat, that we have a body and it's multisensory. And does that generate certain types of intelligences, or are we making a mistake right now and just focusing so much on data and, narrowing our set of what is reality?
Yeah. Thank you for cycling me back to that. Because right. So back to the set of capability tested and performance, we seem to be, we're capable of more than any one of us could possibly be fully characterized as capable of.
Yeah.
So we can do things that nobody is measuring. Upcoming, as I have some friends who are showing up for an event who are human echolocators who use sound in order to build three-dimensional models of the world in real time and ride around on bicycles and, have earned Guinness World Records for doing amazing capabilities that were, up until they started doing them, thought to be impossible for humans.
So these are blind people riding bicycles by using kind of bat-like qualities of echolocation.
Exactly. Yes.
It's amazing.
Yes. Yeah. We do a whole nother episode on that if you want. But yes, so there's these human capabilities that are coming from it's the fact that we can synthesize multiple data streams that are all sorts of different timescales and all sorts of different levels of sensory fusion and meaning making. We are incredibly complex systems. So even if we were just focusing on data and feeding it into a neural network, if we want it to be human-like, we should be aiming to ensure that sound and vision, audio and vision, are somehow processed through the various mechanisms that a brain processes it. Unfortunately, that's still a mystery. There's some levels of understanding that we're getting about how the brain processes things, like vision, enters the optic nerve, and then part of it goes up through the system that does higher level visual gestalt labeling. Another part of it goes through another system, which puts danger, not danger signals in there. Audio comes through. It also splits off and branches into some different pathways, some of which can trigger really fast events, some of which can trigger very slow ones, some of which can do things like build three-dimensional models of the world using just sound. All of these things end up getting built into the sense of reality that we have. And from within this incredible assemblage that we are able to generate thoughts and engage with things in the world that are very, uniquely us. Maybe very unlikely any two people will have, the same level of that data flow into a thing. We all have different retinal distributions. Mine is explicitly different than most people's. But even person to person, the retinal distribution of cells that process color and light are different. Our heads are all different shaped. We have different head-related transfer functions. We have different skin densities. We change differently in different temperatures and humidities. Our sense of touch is modulated by these things. Our emotional system modulates stuff. We are really uniquely complex in how we engage in the world. And I do think that there's something, fundamentally unique about the way that we function to many other creatures, just based on the fact that we have, fundamentally different biology. And then each of us as individuals has our own different biology. And it's not to say that a neural network, which is learning to do some stuff, is not an intelligent system in its own way. There are certainly, I could define a set of capabilities that it's able to do. It can do a thing. It can generate something. It is not to diminish it as not capable of what it is capable of. But if we're really trying to talk human compatible, like born from humanity, there is a real sense of embodiment in our words are modulated by our emotions, our attention is modulated by things happening around us. The amount of nutrients we have inside of us helps keep us focused. So we generate words in this kind of really highly complex process that cascades down through all of these grand sensory systems. And that's really something amazing. And it may well be that we generate the same words as that other system. But I don't quite know if that system being able to mimic everything we do should somehow be conflated with it being capable of doing all of the stuff that got to that point, or if we just ignore that and say it's irrelevant. I'm not sure. And then one extra little bit I'll throw in there is when I am engaging with AI. So there's now video AI that you can chat with. You can show your camera around the room and you can ask it things. And you can say, hey, how do I get out of this room, for instance? And it will visually look around, who knows what that really means. You can point the camera at things and it can say, oh, there's a door over there, walk to it. If I say, hey, how do I get to that door? The typical thing to do for a human is to give visual cues. So it'll say, walk towards the exit sign. I have to explicitly say, I can't use visual cues because my vision is not typical. Can you give me directions on how to get out of the room that don't use visual cues? And now I'm pushing it to, either search deep inside of the database in order to set up, maybe there's some rules that help it generate things for blind people. Maybe there's a prompt engineering thing that can help it. But if it doesn't have a sense of embodied self, it's going to really struggle to do some of that type of route planning, given a totally different, what we sometimes call a sensorium. So if I tell it, I can't see, give me directions, it may be able to do something based on having witnessed people helping blind people on the internet by giving cues such as walk to a wall that you can follow to the door. Or at some point, we should be trying to really push it to do something it's never heard anybody on the internet talk about, helping somebody with a set of capabilities that it would have to truly imagine what what that other creature is having to use, what information that other creature is having to use in order to accomplish the goal that it's requiring. And I think that's a really powerful moment of empathy. And it does draw me back into this obsession with assistive technologies, which is me and the people who I love to build with and the ones that I learn from constantly are the people who say, I want to do this thing. And they're patient and kind enough to explain to me every time I very ignorantly say, what about this way? What about this? And they say, my goodness, you clearly don't understand what's happening inside of me and the information I have from my particular perspective here. And they help bring me into their space. And one of the things I really hope a lot of my students have gained is the ability to, respect that there's a limit to which we, even as people, can imagine the sensorium of another. And so, we are also pushing out in this other type of intelligence, which is this, interpersonal intelligence across different, perspectives and across different sensoriums and across different cultures and across different languages. It may be that AI can sit and learn from how we collaborate and learn how to be a better mediator for that collaboration. But that, to me is one of the most interesting and complex things that we do as people is come together and appreciate some of the incredible different perspectives we have on situations, and we develop ways to communicate about those in order to reach, goals out in the future that we want to coordinate to achieve. So we have a shared value that at some point in the future we want this to happen. And now we have to coordinate action across multiple bodies and intelligences, which nowadays, very, very well almost always does involve some artificial intelligent agent who's doing some part of that game. And how do we get them to that goal in the future while communicating across, unique perspectives and unique sensoriums and different linguistic patterns? That's an incredible amount of flexibility, adaptability, and humbly understanding that what somebody said is not necessarily what I've interpreted it to mean, and allowing for the space and the time, like you do so well, allowing for the space and the time for some of that extra context to come out and trying to understand how that can be interpreted, and having a sense of probabilistic interpretation. That could mean this, that could mean this. Let me ask the clarifying question.
Yeah, that's great. That's fantastic. I mean, we can talk so much more, but I did want to round off with a few personal questions, and also about some of your more near-term events that you're organizing as well. I mean, one of the questions was, you mentioned students a number of times and how you're trying to teach your students this perspective of being more humble and understanding the perspective of others. And more generally, though, what advice would you give to young people as they leave university, to enter the real world? I mean, some of our audience are graduating this year, or they could be graduating next year. And many of them come to me and ask, what should I do career-wise and such? AI is going to eat my job and those sorts of things. What do you tell your students?
What do I tell my? I am of the opinion that the world will be different, and it was different for you and I when we graduated, right? When we were young and moving into the world, it was a different world. Yeah. And right now, and for a very long time, we as humans have adapted our social systems to ensure that we do our best to, continue in dignity together. And I think that working hard, gaining skills, staying on top of things, finding ways to make challenge an exciting and rewarding thing are what drove my career. So I did face a lot of challenge. I graduated with not only the typical undergraduate amount of uncertainty, I graduated with vision that had already killed my first career. So I was, a very confident experimental physicist. I was doing really good research, getting published, and I knew that I could no longer cut steel in a machine shop, and I could no longer wire circuits because I kept getting things in the wrong holes. And so the way that I had learned to do things wasn't going to continue working. I could well have just panicked and given up, but I went out and talked to kind people and told them I'm absolutely willing to work really hard to understand the things that you want me to understand. If you have found a way to make money and I feel positive and I have integrity about the work that I'm doing, then I will absolutely work hard with gratitude to be able to, support that business as part of that business. So, being an employee is being a part of a business. And that is a really important thing to remember is, we're not, we are not here to take from ecosystems. We are here to try to build and support ecosystems. And that does take a mind shift of, how do I give to this thing that is in fact providing stability for many people? So a business provides stability and income in our current, system for the employees and people associated with it. And I focus on that service of, I found work that I enjoy doing. I'm willing to deal with a lot of challenge and learning, and I can focus and recenter frequently on the service to those other employees. And often, there is a lot of kind of skepticism around mission statements and values in companies, but frequently they do come from a great place. And if you lean into them and find people who do embrace them, it can have a really profound impact on the culture and our individual experience of being a part of something that we believe in. Not everyone gets to be, but I sought it. Not every job I had was something that I felt was, changing the world in the way that I want it to change the world. But every job I had was changing the world in a way that I could be proud of, even if it was as small as like I was a busboy. I don't know what it's called in the United Kingdom, but in the US, we would just clear tables after people would eat. So I wasn't even the waiter or the server who would bring the food. I was meant to go out there and clear the tables. And I had a really good manager who could tell that I was struggling a little bit with my sense of importance and having to just clear it. And they sat down and they said, this is a family-run business, and these people are coming in. Each one of them is in the midst of a grand story right now, and they've chosen to spend much more than they have to in order to eat, in order to have an experience. And it's a great service to be able to provide that and to allow them to have a night out doing something that is different than they normally do. And he gave me a proper talking to and helped align my values. And it
That's
stuck
a great
with
story.
me for it stuck with me for a very long time.
Yeah. And just to round off, you recently moved to the UK. You're at Bristol University. You're doing great things there, and you're actually working on quite an important event that's coming up. So I just wanted you to use this opportunity to advertise that event and tell people what it's about, how they can attend, and so on.
Amazing. Thank you for yes, and it is in fact growing, and I'm very excited about it. So on July 14th. In Bristol at the Watershed from 9 a.m. until 5 p.m. We are hosting an event, and it will feature quite an interesting lineup of some of my friends from around the world who have come out to help me celebrate my 1-year anniversary of coming to Bristol and help launch some of my student projects out and give them a bit of publicity to show the world what I've come to do. Some of those guests do include the blind people who use sound in order to do full kind of navigational skills and building a model of the world and being able to interact with it. one of those has 2 Guinness World Records, and we'll be getting to have a panel discussion with him and another fellow who's been doing this for decades and has a TED Talk with 2 million views named Daniel Kish. And we'll get to hear about self-determination is the phrase that he really likes to use, which is how do we as people move our lives forward from a place of dignity and agency. And so I'm very proud to be hosting the event and hoping to raise awareness about human capability and the importance of working together across different sensoriums. And we'll also have some talks from a blind artist from London who's coming out named David Johnson, who is a hyper-fantasial imaginer. So he has, as he describes it, constant visual information in his mind. And so he likes to draw attention to the fact that, what's happening through the outside and what's happening on the inside may not always be what you expect. And I think that's an important thing for people to realize and remember. So, yes, we'll have a day of grand adventures, and we'll get to learn about and get some small demonstrations of the technology we're building, as well as ensuring that we represent right next to it the human capabilities that we want to build towards, both in our technology and in ourselves. So, yeah,
that's fantastic. That's fantastic. Yeah. And what I'll do is I'll include details of the event in the show notes so people can
because I don't yet
navigate to it. Yeah. and finally, what's the best way for people to connect with you, follow your research, generally sort of follow what you're up to?
So I need to. Yeah, I don't actually know what.
Okay. Well, people can reach out to me, and I can share your contact details if they wanted a bilateral introduction at the very least. And otherwise, I assume you must have. Do you have an academic page at Bristol University?
At Bristol,
maybe?
Yeah. There is, but that's not a. I mean, yeah, you can point them to that.
That's perfect. Yeah, that's fine.
Right.
Yeah.
Should I just say something like "follow me," like Google me? I'm famous, don't I?
Yeah. Just Google you. Yeah. Well, with that, I mean, thanks a lot, Carl. Fantastic sort of conversation. I really, really enjoyed it, and good luck with the event.
Thank you so much, Bilal. It is a great honor to be able to have information to share, and I really do hope people who feel like there's something fruitful to be discussed reach out, and we can try to make good things happen.
Thanks for listening to the episode. Please subscribe to the podcast show on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts. Leave a 5-star rating, a nice comment, and let other people know about the show. We'd be super grateful. Finally, sign up for our free newsletter at macrohive.com/free. That's macrohive.com/free. We'll be back soon, so tune in then.